and welcome. It's 8 o'clock and our Amos Fortune Forum is now in session. So welcome to the last of our 7 interesting presentations during our 78th year of the Amos Fortune Forum. And as always, we thank you for your individual and, of course, our corporate sponsors. Without your support and their support, it would be difficult for the Amos Fortune Forum to remain a free series of informative and thought-provoking programs. So as always, we welcome your generous contributions in the begging bowl. You know that real well. As 2 of our Amos Fortune Forum members will be at the back door and also at the front door. You've been very generous this summer. And on behalf of the Amos Fortune Committee, thank you. Don't let up. I want to take just a moment to thank Mikey Osgood for hosting the dinner this evening for our speaker. An interesting arrangement of flowers, and I invite you to come up and take a look at it. From Bonnie Call at Call's Florist is in front of me. And we thank George Crawford for sponsoring the flowers. If you take a quick look, you'll notice what looks like a buffalo. With an arrow in its head. Bonnie's very creative. As always, following the session, all of you are invited to go over to the Parish Hall. Betsy Trimble, thank you, Betsy, and her committee from the Thorndike Club. That includes Helen Fields, Lindra Best, Lisa Bosner, Nicole Foster, and Linda Grant. They've put together a good collection of goodies to munch on, as well as refreshing beverages. This is also a good opportunity for you all to meet the speaker and ask questions if you're unable to do so after his presentation. About this evening's speaker, as we wind up our 78th year of the Amos Fortune Forum, he is an award-winning writer and documentary filmmaker and the author of 14 books, and for more than 30 years, he has collaborated with Ken Burns on documentary films for PBS as a writer and a producer, including Lewis and Clark, The Journey at the Core of Discovery, The National Parks, America's Best Idea, The Dust Bowl, Country Music, and biographies of Mark Twain and Benjamin Franklin. Most recently, he wrote the script, The American Buffalo, as well as its companion book titled Blood Memory. For the national parks, Dayton Duncan received 2 Emmy Awards and was named an honorary park ranger by the director of the National Park Service. His scripts for Benjamin Franklin and the American Buffalo each won the Writers Guild of America Award for Best Documentary Script. Other books and films of his have received awards from the Western Writers of America, the Organization of American Historians, the National Cowboy Hall of Fame, the Christophers, and other organizations. 2 of his books reached the New York Times bestseller list. He has served on the national boards of the Student Conservation Association, the National Park Foundation, and the Conservation Lands Foundation. President Bill Clinton appointed him as chair of the American Heritage Rivers Advisory Committee. Born and raised in Indianola, Iowa, not Indianapolis, Indianola, Duncan graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in German literature and was also a fellow at Harvard's Shorenstein Center for Press, Politics, and Public Policy. I might also add that I went to Villanova University. Dayton went to the University of Penn. And while we were chit-chatting up here, he reminded me of how Villanova had its backside whipped in basketball in 1971, right? I won't ask him how many NCAA championships Penn has not won. Dayton previously served as Chief of Staff to New Hampshire Governor Hugh Gallen and as press secretary to 2 presidential campaigns. He is a recipient of 3 honorary doctorates, including one from Franklin Pierce University in the next town, Rindge. For the last 50 years, he has lived in New Hampshire and made his home in Contoocook Lake in Rindge with his wife, Dianne, who is seated right down here at the very end in the first row. Introducing Dayton Duncan, our speaker this evening at your Amos Fortune Forum, and his topic of how New Hampshire helped save the American buffalo from extinction. Let's give Dayton a warm welcome. You're all set, sir.
Thank you, Bob. Villanova went on to win the national championships after I was gone from Penn. So while I was there, we kicked butt 2 times in the Palestra. I'm a historian, so I just have to make sure the record is correct. So thank you for the introduction. And Mikey, thank you so much for a delicious dinner before this. As another point of personal history, well, this is the 4th time I've spoken here. I love this setting. I love the Amos Fortune Forum. I also realize now, when you said this is the 70th year, I'm older than the Amos Fortune Forum. So thank you for that reminder. But I love this, such a wonderful tradition that you have here. And I echo what Bob said. Please donate what you can on your way out or when you get home. But in 1986, in early August of 1986, I was having dinner at the Monadnock Inn, and out of the blue proposed to Dianne. And I got to say, much to my surprise, she said yes. And the next morning, knowing that we were engaged, she took me down to the bus station at Keene, where I was doing a magazine piece for the Boston Globe magazine on a 30-day Ameripass, going from Keene, New Hampshire to Keene, California. So we'd been engaged for 12 hours and then said goodbye for a month, although she did fly out and met me in San Francisco, and we drove to Lake Tahoe and got married at one of the 3,516 wedding chapels that line Lake Tahoe. Then she flew back to New Hampshire, and I got back on my drive. And 39 years ago Sunday was the day that we got married in Lake Tahoe. So I'm going to take you a little bit farther back in history than 1986. 120 years ago, in 1904, a young eccentric nature writer named Ernest Harold Baines moved from Boston to an abandoned farmhouse in Plainfield, New Hampshire. It was located on the western edge of a sprawling private estate, the Blue Mountain Forest Reservation, it was called, covering 24,000 acres and enclosed by an 8.5-foot high fence. It had been established by a man named Austin Corbin, who had been born nearby in Newport, but became a millionaire financier in New York City, a so-called robber baron who owned the Long Island Railroad and developed Coney Island as a tourist resort. For years, Corbin had been buying up dozens of farmsteads in Sullivan County to create this New Hampshire estate, which he then stocked with exotic game animals, elk and caribou, antelope, reindeer, Himalayan goats, and wild boar from Germany's Black Forest, all for him and his wealthy friends to hunt. In 1892, he had purchased 10 buffalo for $1,000 each from a man named Buffalo Jones in Kansas. And by 1904, 8 years after Corbin had died in a carriage accident, his heirs now had a herd of 100. That same year, the Corbin family agreed to provide an unoccupied house on the property to Baines, who had been scratching out a living by providing newspapers and magazines with feature stories accompanied by photographs by his wife, Louise, about birds and snapping turtles, chipmunks, and opossums. At Blue Mountain, Baines expanded his work, and Louise kept her camera handy. He was a nature writer, a showman, a Dr. Dolittle type character, according to environmental writer Michelle Newhouse. He trained in animals and performed with them in order to inspire among the public the same affection he felt for these animals. And there are wonderful, wonderful photos of this in the Plainfield Historical Society and Meriden Book Club, of birds perching on his lip to bite things, and him playing with all these animals I'm going to describe, just tons and tons of them. They raised wolf pups. They named Death and Dauntless. There was Romulus, the coyote, and Sprite, a little red fox. Baines made friends with one of the newborn wild boars, then brought it with him on his lecture circuit until it grew to 250 pounds with big tusks and a really bad temperament. The couple adopted a bear cub named Jimmy, who ultimately grew into a rambunctious adult, breaking into the house in search of jam and sugar. But what captivated Baines the most was the Corbin buffalo herd, roaming across the nearby pastures and forests. In his first encounter with them, they all galloped away, except for an immense bull, who steadfastly refused to move. It was, he said, a profound moment. Perhaps, he wrote, never did I feel so much ashamed in the presence of any animal as when, standing face to face with that magnificent creature, I thought of the wrongs his race had suffered at the hands of mine, the world's greatest slaughter, the massacre of the buffaloes. The massacre of buffaloes that Baines was referring to reached its tragic climax in the 1870s and early 1880s, when thousands of men swarmed onto the Great Plains in pursuit of buffalo hides, which were shipped back east to be turned into the leather belts that ran the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. This was an insatiable demand, and the hide hunters, using new, more powerful rifles developed specifically for the purpose, wantonly killed millions and millions of buffalo, stripped them of their hides, and then left everything else, the carcasses and their heads and everything else, to rot on the prairies. No one knows how many American buffalo originally roamed the continent. We know that their range was from Mexico to Canada up through the Great Plains, from west of the Rocky Mountains to the eastern seaboard, from Florida to the Great Lakes. There's no record that I could find that there were any here in New England, but there were some up on Lake Erie. A Jamestown colonist sailed up the Potomac River to what is now Washington, D.C. in the 1600s and reported the first thing he came across was a herd of bison. George Washington, as a young surveyor, hunted buffalo on the Ohio River, and before he went to the Continental Congress in 1787, wrote to the manager of his plantation to try to get him a couple of young buffalo that he could raise on the plantation. In Georgia, they passed a bill. The Georgia colonial legislature in 1757 passed a bill outlawing the killing of buffalo in certain parts of the colony because of the troubles it was creating for them and the native people who relied on them. By less than 10 years later, nobody could find any buffalo in the colony of Georgia, so I guess that didn't work, because by the turn of the century, by the 1800s, the buffalo east of the Mississippi were gone. But an estimated 30 million of them still lived on the Great Plains. These numbers were literally still uncountable. But by the time the hide hunters were done in the 1880s, They were actually easily counted. 541 of them were still alive, scattered in a few private herds, in a few zoos, and the only free-roaming wild herd of 200 in Yellowstone National Park. The species was teetering on the brink of extinction. But by the turn of the century, a very diverse and unlikely collection of Americans in various locations, and spurred by sometimes completely contradictory motivations, had begun tentative efforts to pull the buffalo back from the brink. The 10 bison that Austin Corbin had purchased from Buffalo Jones back in 1892 were one small part of those 500 survivors of what had been what the environmental historian Dan Flores has called the greatest slaughter of wildlife in recorded history. And now, Ernest Harold Baines in New Hampshire joined the cause for their salvation. With the help of the preserve's gamekeeper, he captured 3 calves only a few weeks old, 2 young bulls that he named Warwhoop and Tomahawk, and a female he named Sacagawea, and brought them back to his barnyard. At first, he fed them cow's milk from a baby bottle. Soon, he said, they began to treat me with the respect due to the head of the commissary department. Although when they had finished, they had no use for me. And if I attempted to keep on caressing them, one of them would butt me vigorously. Though they made me black and blue and very sore, he added, through those calves, a dying race sent its message to the American people. It spoke of strength and vigor and courage, of a natural fitness to live. And as I thought of them, I felt sure that if the American people would but give the buffalo a chance, every bull, every cow, every tawny calf would do its best to carry on. I decided that the time had come to teach them what they could do for man, in order that he, in turn, might learn what he could do for them. Baines began training Warwhoop and Tomahawk to accept a rope halter and amble down a farm road. Then he put a yoke on the pair and introduced them to a bit and harness to pull a cart. In the first attempt, they galloped off, careening down the road until the cart hit a clump of bushes and turned over, breaking the shafts and splitting in two. But he kept at it, sometimes attaching them to a stone sled to slow the young bulls down, until he said, I had the thing I had been working for, a team of buffalo calves really under control, a convincing bit of evidence that the buffalo can be domesticated and added to our list of draft animals. When they were 5 months old, Baines took them to the Sullivan County Fair, about 10 miles from Blue Mountain, where they created a complete sensation, pulling a stone sled that carried a barrel of apples, then a wagon with a load of hay. And for a grand finale, they pulled him and a small cart around the fair's racetrack at full speed. Now, buffalo bison are big and ungainly looking, but they're actually very agile and fast. They can jump 6 vertical feet, they can leap 9 feet horizontally, and they can reach a speed and sustain it of 35 miles per hour. They're almost as fast as a racehorse. So these 2 young bulls are carting Harold Baines around the Sullivan County racetrack at probably about 35 miles an hour. And he said, I did not see the crowd, for my eyes were on the buffaloes. But plainly did I hear the quick, rushing sound as with one move 10,000 people rose to their feet before breaking into a cheer for my youngsters, who were so nobly, if unconsciously, proving to the American people the value of their race, and who were making a splendid appeal for the preservation of the last few hundreds of North American bison, one of the various grandest animals the world ever produced. Spurred by his success at getting people's attention, Baines took Warwhoop and Tomahawk on the road. You can see little slips up in the archives up in Meriden of the train tickets that he got for Warwhoop and Tomahawk and other things. At a sportsman's show in Boston, President Theodore Roosevelt's son, Theodore Jr., was allowed to drive the buffalo cart. At the New England Fair in Worcester, Massachusetts, Baines challenged anyone who dared to match their domestic steers of the same age as his bison bulls to what he called contests of speed and strength. There were no takers. These exhibitions had two effects on the farmers, Baines wrote. One, the swift conviction that the calves were as speedy and strong as I said they were. The other, that while they were docile now, there was no telling how long they would be. Baines hitches them up, one local farmer said, and they take him where they damn please. By the time Warhoop and Tomahawk were 2.5 years old, they were famous. Baines brought them to the Central Maine Fair, where a young farmer accepted his challenge for a race, but only had a single steer, so Baines selected Warhoop for that race. The result, Baines wrote, was not in doubt for a moment. This was the last appearance of my calves, he added. They were trained to awaken interest in the American bison, and they had done their share. I took them back to Sacagawea. Then I brought all three of them back to the Corbin herd. Their work was over. Now, because of the costs involved, the Corbin family had been talking about getting rid of their buffalo herd. To save the bison as a species, Baines now believed a national organization should be created, and the federal government needed to establish several more protected herds besides the one in Yellowstone National Park. Relying on private ownership, he thought, was not enough. If an individual owns a herd and that individual dies, like Austin Corbin, his heirs might sell them off for slaughter. That was a real vulnerability. And the confines of zoos and uncertainties of private herds provided no guarantee that buffaloes would exist for another generation. And there were other threats as well. With so few bison concentrated in such small pockets, it was perfectly plausible that a disease could break out and kill half of the animals left in the world. Baines had been corresponding with William T. Hornaday at the Bronx Zoo, another champion of saving the bison, who worried about crossbreeding with cattle, so-called cattle or beefalo, and about what's called a genetic bottleneck developing, because most of the existing collections of bison were so small, with only one prominent bull, made them susceptible to inbreeding and genetic anomalies. So for the species to escape genetic extinction, or even worse, disappearing forever into total extinction, large, dedicated spaces were needed so larger herds could be established, and to provide the stability to that effort, the federal government needed to become actively involved in a national organization spearheading the movement. I love this, and Ken loved this little factoid that we made sure to put in our film. In Walpole, New Hampshire, where Ken lives and where Dianne and I lived for 32 years, in Walpole, New Hampshire, Baines discussed his ideas with Professor Franklin W. Hooper, then the director of the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences. Hooper encouraged him to write a number of prominent Americans, including President Theodore Roosevelt. The president responded enthusiastically and promised to address the issue in his upcoming annual address to Congress, in which Roosevelt asked for authorization to set aside portions of federal land as game refuges for, he said, the preservation of the bison and other large beasts once so abundant and now tending toward extinction. To enlist support for the president's proposal, Baines then launched a speaking tour and dispatched a flurry of articles to newspapers and magazines. One I loved particularly was entitled "Help Save the Buffalo" for the Nature Study Club of Women's Home Companion, in which he proposed a letter-writing campaign to bolster the cause. Here's what he wrote. "We can save the buffalo if we all work together. Let each one make a point of getting a letter addressed to me from some prominent man or woman stating that he or she is in favor of the government taking immediate steps to preserve the few remaining buffaloes. In leading this movement, he added, I need all the letters of this kind I can get, and I want one from every part of the country. Don't fail to get me at least one. And I know that you will be glad to have had a hand in saving for America the grandest of all her native animals. On June 2nd, 1905, President Roosevelt signed an executive order designating 60,000 acres of national forest in Oklahoma as the Wichita Forest and Game Preserve. It was the first such refuge of its kind. And 6 months later, in the reception room of the Bronx Zoo's Lion House, the first meeting was convened of a new organization, the American Bison Society, the fruit of the idea Baines had been promoting for more than a year. The objects of this society, the group declared, shall be the permanent preservation and increase of the American bison. William T. Hornaday was elected as its president. Baines was elected as its secretary. Theodore Roosevelt agreed to lend his name and prestige as honorary president. He kept his job as real president, but he was happy to be honorary president of the Bison Society. With the creation of the Bison Society, Baines immediately then went to work publicizing it and soliciting, as he could always do, donations and memberships. He embarked on a lecture tour, and in every town he gained editorial support from local newspapers. And again, up in Meriden, they have all these appeals that he made and stories that were written and editorials to back him. Meanwhile, with President Roosevelt's support, William Hornaday began lobbying Congress to put up $15,000 for fencing and buildings at the new preserve. And to sweeten the bargain, Hornaday promised that the Bronx Zoo would donate 15 of its purebred buffalo to provide the sea stock. The Bronx Zoo was one of the few places where there were still buffalo in those days. And on October 11th, 1907, everything was ready. Hornaday had personally designed special crates for each animal. There were 9 cows and 6 bulls for their 1,500-mile journey to Oklahoma. And at the Fordham Railroad Station in the Bronx, they were loaded onto 2 freight cars, usually reserved for transporting expensive thoroughbreds, with collapsible stalls, large water tanks, and plenty of hay. And then began one of the most unlikely buffalo migrations in history. Because you got to remember that for half a century, millions and millions of buffalo hides had been shipped east by the railroad. And then after they were all gone, then they scavenged the plains for the bones. Tens of millions of tons of buffalo bones had followed the same railroad routes to factories that ground them up for the use as fertilizer. And now, 15 live bison were on a train going west from the largest metropolis in America. Some of them, no doubt, were descendants of bison that had originated from private herds on the southern plains, and therefore would be returning to the land of their ancestors. They were going home. That's not the only irony of this remarkable story of return. Consider this. The American buffalo and native people had coexisted on this continent for more than 12,000 years before the arrivals of newcomers from Europe. In the ancient origin stories of many plains tribes, the bison were among the earliest animals created, often emerging before human beings from underground crevices or caves in what became for those people sacred sites, like Wind Cave in the Black Hills of what is now South Dakota. And over the centuries, Native people wove the animals into every aspect of their daily lives and their religious beliefs. They relied on the animal for everything, for food, for clothing, for shelter, and much, much more, because they developed a relationship that they still consider a kinship with the buffalo, in which special ceremonies were required to renew the covenant between the humans and the natural world. And during those centuries upon centuries, every tribe encountered occasional seasons when the buffalo seemingly disappeared and the people obviously suffered. It was believed that the herds had returned where they came from, usually underground. For our film, the Kiowa poet, now late Kiowa poet, Scott Momaday explained it this way. The buffalo, gives itself to the people as a sacrifice, he said. Here I am. You can make use of me. I can help you. We can be related on a spiritual plane. And so when the people did something wrong, he continued, if that trust, if that bond was broken, the buffalo might well react and withhold their affection. No, I will not make myself available to you for hunting. I will hide. You will have to find me, and it will not be easy. According to the environmental historian Dan Flores, the stories almost always convey a sense that it's been human hubris that's caused the animals to withdraw. And the only way to get them back is to perform some kind of really profound ceremony, some act that convinces the animals that humans are, once again, willing to be fellow travelers in the world. Not exceptional, not standing apart, but part of the ecology of all living things. For a number of tribes on the southern plains, the sacred place of both original emergence and occasional hiding was in the Wichita Mountains, specifically its most prominent peak, Mount Scott. 7 days after their departure from New York City in 1907, the buffalo arrived at the train station in Cache, Oklahoma, and were taken 12 miles by wagon to a holding corral before their release into the new preserve. Among the spectators awaiting them was a crowd of Comanches and Kiowas, some of them old enough still to remember the days when buffalo covered the prairie, and some of them children who had only heard about buffalo in stories. For nearly 2 generations following the destruction wrought by the hide hunters in the 1870s, the Kiowa had passed along a legend told by Old Lady Horse about the last buffalo herd the Kiowas had seen. That herd had walked, she said, into Mount Scott, which opened up to receive them, quote, where the world was green and fresh as it had been when she was a small girl, where the rivers ran clear, not red, and the wild plums were in blossom, chasing the red buds up the inside slopes. Into this world of beauty, she said, the buffalo walked, never to be seen again. But now, in 1907, they were back. And after some time in the holding corral, the 15 buffalo from the Bronx Zoo were let loose, free to wander on their new and old home within sight of Mount Scott. For Scott Momaday, that completeness of that circle seemed transcendent. Old Lady Horse, he said, I like to think of her there. If you think of the interior of the mountain as being green and lush, maybe the last buffalo range of all, you can imagine them coming back at some point. This mountain will open up again, and they will come back, and it will be as it was. We will be alive again in our souls. If you're going to have a return of the buffalo, he added, it should be there where they disappeared. That's somehow fitting, and as it should be. If she had seen their return, I think she would have dropped to her knees and wept in thanksgiving. Her sense of the sacred would have been realized at that moment as the high point of her life. That makes the story whole. Less than a month after the buffalo's arrival, 2 calves were born, and within 6 years, the herd had nearly doubled in size. But Baines's campaign was not quite yet finished. A second federal bison preserved was proposed for northwestern Montana, and his American Bison Society promised a private campaign this time to raise $10,000 to buy the seed stock. And Baines enthusiastically threw himself into the fund drive, spending much of 1908 on the road giving 113 lectures and producing reams of copy for any publication that would run it. Calling the bison, quote, our national animal, and arguing that the breeding of cataloes is not really saving the buffalo, he pressed the cause with urgency. According to a proverb he wrote, there are three things which once gone never return to a man: the spoken word, the sped arrow, and I lost my place. What's the third, Dayton? Spoken word, the sped arrow, and the lost opportunity. Our opportunity to prevent the massacre of the buffaloes has gone. But our opportunity to save the survivors, and thus to pay in part the debt we owe the race, is here. And we must make it now, if ever. And his persistence paid off. His fund drive raised $10,565.50, exceeding its goal. And he also persuaded some owners of private herds to donate some of their buffalo, including 3 from the Corbin family here in New Hampshire. So by the fall of 1909, about 3 dozen buffalo were released to graze on the new National Bison Range. And the United States now had 3 federal herds under protection in Yellowstone, the Wichita Mountains, and western Montana. Within the next 6 years, more protected herds were established at Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota's Black Hills, and nearby Custer State Park, at Fort Niobrara in Nebraska. And though it eventually didn't do well enough to continue, a federal herd was even established in a national forest near Asheville, North Carolina, stocked by 6 buffaloes from the Corbin family. By 1933, the American Bison Society reported that 4,404 buffalo existed in 121 herds in 41 different states. More than half of those buffalo were grazing in 9 government-protected herds. Now, compared to the millions of buffalo that once covered the plains, those were tiny numbers, but enough, and in enough different places, that the Bison Society began making plans to disband, declaring the American buffalo was finally safe from extinction and its job was done. Ernest Harold Baines, back in New Hampshire, didn't live long enough to take part in that announcement. He had died in 1925 at age 56 in Meriden, New Hampshire. His ashes were scattered on Croydon Mountain near his home, where he had first encountered that improbable, shaggy beast that he had helped save from disappearing forever, and that now is actually the official national mammal of the United States. Thank you. Okay, so we got time for some questions. So raise your hand, stand up, give them a shout. I'll repeat it for the people and do my best to answer. Yeah, ma'am. Okay, how many bison herds are there now? There's not a precise count. There are about, but there's at least 500,000 now in the United States. A great majority of them are sort of raised like cattle in conditions like cattle are, but I think about 30-some thousand or more are raised in conditions that would mimic at least free roaming. In other words, large enough spaces that, they don't feel like they can be buffalo and aren't then taken to a feedlot and, fed corn and stuff like that before they're taken to a slaughterhouse. And the most exciting things of that really is going on with is the Intertribal Buffalo Council I can't remember exactly how many native tribes that have formed that, in which they have been working with the federal government and other people to get bison to return to their reservations, to bring them home, to help strengthen and the connection that had been broken for more than 100 years. They can serve for help their food sovereignty. They can help them, repeat and keep the traditions that their ancestors had, and that's where a lot of that activity is, and it's really exciting. As I told Ken when we were working on this, I said, this is really a 3-act play, and we're just telling the first 2, right? We're telling how many there were, and then how quickly and dramatically they were, nearly exterminated. Act 2 is people trying to save them, at least from extermination. And we're right now in the start of Act 3 of to what extent will they come back in greater numbers and in greater conditions where they can be what they once were, at least in large swaths of the plains, and become the keystone species that they once were. Yes, sir.
To what extent are they protected? They are not protected.
To what extent are they protected? Well, in the federal preserves, Yellowstone. Well, let me set Yellowstone aside for a second. In the reserves, Bison Reserve in Montana and the Wichita Mountains and these other parks and preserves, they're protected there. In many of the nonprofit organizations besides the tribes are also doing these things on a large scale. They're protected from, wanton slaughter. And then they're protected on private ranch until it's time to ship them to the slaughterhouse. But they're still, breeding them, although there's worries that some of those get a little too many cow genes in them. And in Yellowstone, they're protected until they cross out of the park. Buffalo need to move to be buffalo, and in the wintertime particularly, they want to move down off the plateau that is Yellowstone National Park, and they emerge out onto state land, and they're not necessarily protected there. But they're gaining in numbers. I'm going to go over to this side, though. I'll say back there. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question about the slaughter in the 19th century, the 1870s. You said it was mostly because of industrial use, but the hives later about the remoteness of the animal being used for feed.
Yeah.
It's such an enormous slaughter. Was the only reason to do it industry and feed, or was there some other thing going on?
The question is, can everybody sort of hear the question? Was it just for the hides and the bones and the commercial industrial uses that were there other things going on? Over the years, the number of buffalo once they were only on the Great Plains diminished. There was a time when here in Jaffrey, it would have been in the 1830s and 40s, very fashionable if you wanted to get in your carriage to go from Jaffrey Center down to East Jaffrey. You'd want a nice warm buffalo robe to put on your lap. And so there was a commercial demand for that. There were, by that point, steamboats that were going up the Missouri River. And so traders would bring goods to trade with Indian people for them to kill more just for those hides, more than the Indians needed for their own subsistence. So the numbers were diminishing a little bit. By the end of the Civil War, they were down from 30 million down to about 12 or 13 million, around there. And that's when somebody developed a way to tan a buffalo hide to make it as supple and strong as a cow hide to run all the machinery, mostly on the East Coast. And of course, the bison were, quote, free. They're just out there. You didn't have to have a rancher, provide his stock for those belts. And it was a time of a financial panic, and so thousands upon thousands of guys now able to get there because of trains instead of steamboats came out, and within a decade and a half, 13 million of them were gone. And because the only thing that they were really interested in was the hides, they would just leave the rest out there to rot. And then someone discovered, the bones can be ground up for fertilizer and charcoal black and other things. And so more profit was made shipping the bones back than was made shipping the hides out. Actually, it's been discovered. And as one of the people in our film said, it was like covering up a crime scene, You wanted to get the bones out of there. So it was, but it was that insatiable demand. They only stopped shooting, they only stopped killing bison for their hides when there weren't any bison to shoot anymore. If they had still been, if they'd been in the numbers that people sort of believe, like you can't kill them all, they would have kept at it for years and years more. Yes, sir.
Buffalo Bill and his tour came to Keene. Could you talk a little about Buffalo Bill and whether it was all minuses or whether there were some pluses to his tour?
So the question's about Buffalo Bill, who did come to Keene. He's a great character. He's this great, to me, symbol of what the West is, because there's, he actually was a buffalo hunter. He killed, 4,000 in a year's time to feed the railroad crews that were building the railroads across Kansas. He really was a scout for the Army, but he's also a great showman. And he connected in the time of dime novels, found out there were dime novels were written about his exploits, making up things out of whole cloth, of course. And he found out that they were doing a play about him, so he rushed east to do that. Said, if somebody's going to make money being me, it's going to be me. And so he went on the stage, but then he occasionally, interrupt that and rush back out to join the 7th Cavalry in a, punitive campaign against the Lakotas, and then he'd come back. So he was, somebody called him in our film the first of the great roadside attractions of the West. His extravaganzas, his outdoor extravaganzas, attracted millions upon millions of people at the turn of the century. Would sell out, these great fields in New York and Europe. Would sell out Madison Square Garden in the winter. And the great finale of it, one of the great finales of it, he'd reenact these things like a wagon train would be attacked, and of course, Buffalo Bill would save them. And then a homesteader's cabin would be burning and attacked to be saved by Buffalo Bill. And, those kind of things until Custer, they did a reenactment of Custer's Last Stand, and then Bill would finally ride up and they'd have a big banner that said, "Too late," If only he had been there, right? But the most popular thing was he helped preserve the species from extinction, because one of the great attractions for him was to have about 20, 30 buffalo with him, and he'd do a stampede and fire at them with blanks around, as they did. So millions of people who would have no prospect of ever seeing a live buffalo and get any sense of just how majestic and how powerful and how unbelievable they are, saw it. And he was part of it. But, you also got to be careful about what he says about himself and want to double check it, you know. Like they say when you're a newspaper reporter, if Mama says she loves you, check it out. Really so with Bill. There was somebody in the back that had his hand up, and then I'll get to you, ma'am. Yeah, way back there.
Here's a question I should have asked in school a long time ago. What's the difference between a bison and a buffalo?
The difference between a bison and a buffalo is a pedantic argument. The scientific name for the American buffalo is their species is a bison. Genesis bison, and if they're from the plains, they're bison. So they're bison, bison, bison. Makes it easier to remember. They have been called from the time they were first discovered. The Spanish saw them. They had a name for them. They saw them in the Southwest, Spanish explorers. French coming down the Mississippi saw them. They had their own name for it. English colonists came, and they saw them, and they called them buffalo. And that stuck because it reminded them of the Cape buffalo that they'd heard about at the tip of Africa. The Cape buffalo are not of the same species, and the water buffalo of Asia are not the same species as our buffalo. But the Cape buffalo aren't buffalo either, and the Cape and the water buffalo aren't buffalo. They're each their own species. So we decided when we were making our film to call it the American buffalo, which most of the people that we talked to were perfectly fine with, although many of them, particularly if they're scientists, would more likely call them bison. The native people prefer, if you're speaking English, they all had, every tribe had its own name for the animal. Obviously, it wasn't buffalo; it was whatever, Tatanka, if you're a Lakota. But they said they prefer buffalo. But so we would use it interchangeably. They mean the same thing, particularly if you're saying American buffalo. So we all know what we're talking about. People raise this with us while we're working on it, and frankly, stick in my craw a little bit. So I would just say, well, so do we have to change it to Bison Bill? Will that make sense? Or there's a city in New York that would probably have some questions about it. And I said, and by the way, just for the sake of this argument, prairie dogs ain't dogs. They're squirrels. Ground squirrels. So are we okay with that? So anyway, so they're the same thing. But some people get kind of saying, well, we had when it was first put in the press that we were making a thing called the Buffalo, we got a snarky letter that said, perhaps you should let Mr. Burns and Mr. Duncan know that they are not buffalo, they are bison.
You mentioned when they often move seasonally. At the 1939 World's Fair, which was all about planning across the country, there was a reference to the buffalo as the first interstate highway planners. They had never set up one.
Yeah. Yeah, the question is about them as the first interstate highway planners. Yeah, Daniel Boone, when he crossed what's called the Cumberland Gap, to the Wilderness Trail from Virginia into what is now Kentucky, was following what would be called at that time a buffalo trace. In other words, it's a trail that buffalo for thousands of years had taken to get from point A to point B. They would have figured out a long time before humans, and particularly whites, showed up, the best way to get through that mountain range. And there'd be a well-worn path. And so when he took that over, he said, got into what's now Kentucky. He said there are more buffalo here than there are cattle back in Virginia. Lewis and Clark, you know, a lot of times when they were having trouble finding their way, when they were off the river and trying to get over the mountains, they'd say, we sort of lost the trail, meaning they lost the trail that Indians had used themselves following the bison trail. And when they were coming back, and Lewis was going to try this shortcut to the Great Falls from what's now Missoula, and was worried because the guides that had brought them back over the Bitterroot Mountains said they were going back to their people and didn't want to go out in the plains because their enemies lived out there. And they said, well, how will I do it? And they basically said, the Buffalo Trail is so plain that even a white man can find it, okay? They didn't use those words, but so yeah, they're important. Of course, they're so important to the ecology. You know, when they wallow in the ground in the Great Plains, that creates, to get bugs and stuff off them, that creates this depression that then more water settles there, and that encourages plants that might not otherwise grow. That's then good for birds, but also good for native people. The things that they would pick up on the little fur near their hooves of, you know, these certain types of plants had certain types of seeds that would file that, and that would be, you know, taken to something. Their poop is, you know, would be fertilizer. Yeah, they were incredibly important. But I hadn't heard that one about the first interstate highways, but they were pretty good at that. Yes, ma'am.
Two questions. One, you mentioned Niobrara.
Yeah.
I was there in '89, so is it typical when these establishments are made for the buffalo that they keep going, they don't go keep on the other questions, whether the narrative is always
Okay. The question first is, I'll do it in reverse order. So I referred to, there's two places that you can go to find out more about Harold Baines. One is the Plainfield Historical Society in Plainfield, New Hampshire. And the other one is, well, I think, and it's more likely to be open than the Meriden Bird Club. Baines was also helped found the first bird clubs in America. That was another part of what he did. And they came across the Meriden Book Club and the Plainfield Historical Society. Somebody up in their attic came across a trunk of stuff that had all of the plate negatives that Louise Baines had taken of her husband. You know, hundreds and hundreds of them, and his notebooks and things like that. And they raised money to help, you know, restore those photographs and you know, to preserve the information. Niobrara is a preserve, is on the northern border of Nebraska and South Dakota, where not surprisingly the Niobrara River flows through. And the question was, do they mate for the male and females?
No, I was wondering if it's still there, when an establishment is made for buffalo,
Niobrara, I think, was first a military reserve, and then became something else. And then when they started this thing, let's move these things to a lot of other places besides just the two reserves. It was a small herd. I think it's still. I'm pretty sure it's still there. I mean, well, I'm pretty sure it was there when I went by in 1996. But you know, but anyway. It's not a big herd, and you could easily drive through it and not see them. One last one, yeah.
There on Catalina Island,
Yeah.
California,
Yeah.
there was a significant group there.
Yeah. I don't know if they are still there. This is a buffalo herd on Catalina Island off the coast of California. They were brought there for a film. And the film being made, they just left them there. And so, they grew in number, and they, became a nuisance in certain places, but then they were somewhat protected. And I don't know for sure. I want to say that there's some that are still there, but don't hold me to it. They also had one on the island, the big island in Great Salt Lake. There was a herd there for the same reason, for some filming, and then they left it and it grew. And I believe that they finally decided they had to get those things. That was just not the right place for a buffalo herd. Can I take this one last one? Yeah, ma'am.
I was on Catalina 2 years ago, and there was about 1,200 there.
Okay. 1,200 in Catalina? Okay. There you go. And you got one, kind of.
Yeah, I'm struck by the fact that it took an individual to really drive the passion to protect the buffalo. And I'm struck by the fact that we have a neighbor in Harrisville who wrote a book about the return of the bald eagle. And it's the same thing. It was a very compassionate, over-the-top, not going to give up person.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, as I said, if you watch our film, read my book, it wasn't just Ernest Harold Baines who saved the buffalo. There were a couple Indian families in South Dakota and Montana. Buffalo Jones guy down there, Charlie Goodnight, a hard-bitten rancher in the Panhandle of Texas. So there were a lot of people. Ernest William T. Hornaday at the Bronx Zoo, and originally at the Smithsonian. So it wasn't him. I wanted to focus on him because it's New Hampshire, and I thought it's kind of improbable when you think about it. But the larger point that you allude to is something that I feel very strongly about, and we encountered that also in our film about the national parks. How so many things that we take for granted, national parks, they've always been there, or the government came down and saved it. Oh, the bison, the federal government, finally intervened and saved them. That's somewhat true, but they got to it near the end of the game and helped push it over. In virtually every national park that we wrote about and used in our film, it was the opposite of that. It was somebody who came across a beautiful place, a lake or a mountain or a volcano, you name it, and fell in love with that place and loved it so much and wanted so much that other people, particularly their own generations that might follow them, could have that same experience and then start devoting themselves to how do you accomplish that, and just keeping at it. And the two inspiring things about that to me always is, and the same thing with Harold Baines, is this perseverance. It's never easy. All these things take a long time, hard work, some luck every once in a while, but keeping at it. But that's what, then you can, if it finally works right, then you finally get the federal or state government to do what they should have done in the first place. But it takes that individual passion and commitment, personal, organizational, reaching out and finding other people to do that. And that's, to me, a great story of America. So on that. That was me as an honorary park ranger speaking there at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Well, I think that was a very, very informative presentation by Dayton. I don't want to make a pun, but it was very moving. My wife's going to kill me. Dayton, we always make it a pleasure to recognize and honor our good presenters, which you certainly are, with a half gallon of New Hampshire maple syrup.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, in a second. Now, before we end the session, 2 requests. Number 1, there are these cards. And one of the things that you can provide us is what would you like to see next year? A topic, perhaps a presenter. Don't be shy. There's pens and there are cards. And if you're not in our mailing list, by all means, let us know. We'll be glad to send you emails with each presentation. The second thing is that the very first presentation, which was Alan Rumrill, going back 7 weeks ago, Brad Smith, our chairperson, said, who would like to join the Amos Fortune Committee. And one person came up to me a couple of weeks ago. We took that gentleman's name. But if you'd like to have some fun, have a say in what goes on, and be involved, please see me right afterwards. We'd appreciate it. So, as we close out our 79th season, I'd like to suggest 2 things to you. Good health to all of you, and happiness between now and next year, and we'll see you next year. This formally closes the Amos Fortune Forum session for tonight and for our 78th season.
I thought you said 70 or 7.